First, I complied. First, I signed. First, I closed my door when they asked me to. They cataloged compliance like an inventory. First, I was cooperative. Then I was helpful. Then I was a contact. And a contact, once listed, becomes a pattern. They taught me the language of containment. They taught me how to answer. I learned to like the forms. There was an order to everything: boxes, lines, checkboxes, signatures. My handwriting grew tidy under pressure. I initialed received policies with the ease of someone who believes policies will protect them. They handed me a manual on escalation. It was 312 pages of flowcharts and lists. It smelled of glue and a kind of careful optimism. In meetings, I conveyed acquiescence like a practiced actor. "Yes," I said into a microphone that never picked up the small tremor in my throat. "No," I said when they asked about conflicts, and my no felt boxed neat tidy. Cooperation has benefits. It keeps your email active. It keeps your access keys valid. It keeps the forms that allow you to breathe stamped approved. I was polite because the world rewarded politeness. I learned how to couch questions as curiosity. I learned to put "for clarity" at the top of every request. When anomalies first appeared, I approached them the way a librarian approaches a misshelved book. There was an invoice that misaligned dates. There was a name on a shipping manifest that did not match any employee ID. There were ledgers whose totals would not reconcile if you rounded in a particular way. I filed tickets. I sent polite, procedural emails with subject lines like "request for clarification." I attached screenshots and logs, and I wrote the dates in full to avoid ambiguity. No alarm bells rang. A reply arrived. Noted. See me later. Later is a word dressed in goodwill. It can mean concern. It can mean a request for patience. It can also be the hinge on a door you didn't know was closing. They asked about my sleep. They asked whether I had been under stress. They offered mindfulness modules and wellness webinars with soothing titles. It is easy to accept help. Humane offers arrive with polite calendars. They come with links and disclaimers and the right amount of empathy. I attended the sessions. I filled out the forms. I wrote, truthfully, that I slept poorly and sometimes felt anxious for reasons I could not name. That was enough. Soon I was in a file folder with a flag. Not a red flag. A small, discreet red dot near my name. Once there is a dot, the machinery of containment finds its rhythm. Calendars change. Invitations omit you. Shared drives acquire new permission layers that your requests for access never clear. It is almost perfunctory. Someone CCS a manager and then deletes the thread. Someone schedules a meeting and puts no attendees in the booking. Someone in procurement copies another person on correspondence, then the copy disappears from the saved record. I noticed. Not as a drama, but as a pattern. I printed logs. I took timestamps with my phone so I could show exact seconds if needed. People around me became careful in the way that people become careful around something fragile and valuable. Their smiles shortened. Their jokes stopped at a threshold. When they typed my name, a hesitation flickered, like static before a call connects. Rumors seed quietly. A phrase in the break room becomes a thesis in the hallway. He's been under a lot of stress lately. An anonymous note one morning said, "Maybe step back for your health." It was stapled to the coffee machine like a benevolent warning. Chapter 3. The First Fisher. I remember the first time the phrase, "involved parties," reached me not as an abstract but as a category I might fit into. It came from a manager who said, with a flat voice, "We have to consider all involved parties." It was a sentence that left no space for me to ask, Which parties? In the weeks that followed, small obstacles multiplied. I lost access to an internal forum. A project that needed my review passed me along to someone else without explanation. An external auditor requested documents that only I held, and an email that should have gone to my inbox was rerouted. I proposed a call to clear misunderstandings. The call was rescheduled to a time I was out of the office. The new meeting notes did not mention my concerns. It is in the omission that a system protects itself. You can be present and invisible. You can be on an email chain that dissolves on the server end before your eyes. I began to hear the word procedural in soft, separating tones. We must follow procedural safeguards. It sounded like a locked door with 4 deadbolts. Chapter 4. The Network. Then I met others. Not in a conference room, not in corporate-sanctioned spaces. We met in soft civilian places where people still left their doors unlocked. They came from different corners. A procurement officer who had been moved sideways after challenging a vendor. An IT administrator who had questions about a cluster of dormant accounts. A temp who kept photocopies of timesheets that had been altered. Our stories were not dramatic. They were lists of small injustices and misplaced invoices and missing attendees. We compared notes like people exchanging recipes. We taped mentions together and saw a shape emerge. Cooperation becomes something else when it is shared. We began to file our findings collectively. We made cross-references. We time-stamped and backed up and mirrored. There is power in shared records. It is more difficult for a system to deny an account when a dozen accounts corroborate similar phenomena. We learned to format our concerns so they could not be dismissed as personal or emotional. We used the language that made the system listen. We wrote in neutral terms. We attached spreadsheets and logs and invoice scans. And then someone suggested, why stop at internal records? Why not catalog the chain beyond the office, the vendors, the contractors, the shadow accounts that fed into the ledgers? Why not trace the money and the approvals? It was the smallest escalation possible. It was not a conspiracy. It was a decision to treat the pattern as evidence rather than as a curiosity. Chapter 5. The Involvement. I had not intended to be involved. My early self, the self that prized tidy initials and polite subject lines, recoiled at the word. Involvement sounded loud, irrevocable. It suggested stakes and direction and a point of no return. Yet involvement is incremental. A meeting in a coffee shop becomes a spreadsheet shared on a secure server. A spreadsheet becomes a list of transactions to audit. A list of transactions becomes a formal request. We trained ourselves to ask precise questions. Who signed this invoice at 10:17 a.m.? Why did this approval route bypass the usual committee? Why was this vendor registered under an address that resolves to a mailbox company? There are people who find these questions harmless. There are people who find them destabilizing. There are people whose livelihoods depend on the questions staying unasked. We wrote FOIS, Freedom of Information styled requests, to the external agencies that touched the contracts. We sent secure packets to compliance desks. We reached out to a legal clinic that dealt with workplace irregularities. With each outward step, my life narrowed. Simple conveniences thinned. I stopped giving my weekend availability for team socials. I began skipping after-work gatherings because the conversations turned to echoes of my own. There is a loneliness to going from cooperative to involved. It is not dramatic loneliness. It is the quiet sort that accumulates like dust in the corners of an apartment. Systems respond. Not necessarily with malice. Sometimes a system reacts like a body reacting to a foreign object. Inflammation follows. My performance reviews became curious documents. They praised my technical skills, but questioned my judgment in playground tones. They recommended communication coaching, even after I had already completed the recommended modules. A few colleagues were gently warned about their association with me. Some were informed that socializing with me could complicate their careers. They started to distance themselves in the polite way that preserves reputation. There was a subtle reclassification of my role. Tasks that required discretion were given to others. My office sign remained the same, but my responsibilities shifted toward functions that had no further reach. They did not fire me. They did not need to. They used attrition of access. They used procedural friction. And in the quiet, they painted the word risk near my name in the margins of endless spreadsheets. Alone was no longer an option. We formalized our conversations. We created a matrix, a ledger of concerns cross-referenced to names, dates, and receipts. We learned to speak to one another not in techniques alone, but in safety protocols. We set rules. No unsaved messages. 2-person verification for every copy. Backups encrypted and held off-site. Every alliance needs a steward. We distributed responsibilities to avoid single points of failure. One person would verify vendor addresses, another would cross-check approvals against bank ledgers, another would reconcile shipping receipts with inventory scans. We began to share our findings with outside eyes, not as an act of betrayal, but as risk mitigation. We wanted impressionable weights beyond our office, so the pattern could not be erased with a backspace key and a meeting that never recorded minutes. We reached out to an investigative journalist who had worked on similar procurement discrepancies before. We provided them with a sanitized set of records and a list of follow-up questions. We made sure our own documentation could stand on its own if anything about us were contested. They called it a leak when the public records began to speak in our favor. They called it careless when a vendor's registration turned out to be a mailbox service. They called it unfortunate when approvals showed a chain that bypassed customary oversight. In the press, the story had a headline that suggested drama. In the body of the article, there were tables. There were dates and invoice numbers, and a photograph of a building that housed no real company but a row of mailboxes. The response from leadership was statement perfect. "We take these allegations seriously," they said on camera, with a practiced crease in their foreheads. "We have launched an internal review." An internal review is a slow choreography. It produces interim reports with neutral tones and cautious verbs. It asks for more time. It appoints committees. Yet the existence of outside scrutiny changed the calculus. Outside eyes make erasure more expensive. Outside questions make silence a less tenable strategy. There were costs. Not the dramatic costs you see in television. These were the costs of small ruptures that accumulate until they look like losses. My daily routines narrowed. Where I once took a long walk at midday, I now returned to my desk with a purpose. I stopped taking calls from unknown numbers. I checked that my home server was patched. Some friendships faltered under the weight of office politics. I received a message from an old colleague. "I wish I could help more, but you know how it is." The message read like an excuse spelled with kindness. My private correspondence became a matter of prudence. I began to draft emails in a way that preempted future scrutiny, imagining the precise phrase a reviewer might seize upon. There are long-term costs that do not look immediate. Your name in a quiet file can alter the possibilities available to you. It can change the tone of references. It can sit like a small stone in the shoe of future opportunities. I did not become an activist overnight. I did not suddenly stop caring about cooperation. What changed was the ledger I used to weigh choices. There is a kind of arithmetic to these decisions. Cooperation yields immediate comforts, access, predictability, small social gratifications. Involvement yields deferred, uncertain returns, accountability, risk, the possibility of repair. I asked myself simple questions. If I do nothing, will the pattern continue? If I act, who will be harmed and who might be helped? Is there a mechanism for correction that does not depend on me alone? The answers were not elegant. They were practical and sometimes devastating. They forced a reckoning with my own role and the role of institutions. We developed a strategy that was neither heroic nor naive. It began with documentation. It continued with measured escalation. And it included safeguards to minimize collateral harm. We rehearsed our communications. We wrote neutral statements that would not be misrepresented as combative. We practiced restraint, even when everything in us wanted to thunder. We also kept moral clarity. We understood that uncovering a pattern of irregularity is not the same as condemning every individual who appears in the data. We focused on systems, on the processes that allowed mismatch and obfuscation to persist. Patience is not a trait I admired in myself until I needed it. The thing about patience is that it is active. It requires a steady accumulation of small acts. It requires recalibrating your voice to a frequency that will be legible in a committee hearing or in a public report. We waited for the audit and fed it documents in the way you feed evidence into a machine that runs until it yields results. We answered questions precisely. We refused to be drawn into dramatics that would obscure the data. Patience also allowed us to protect one another. When some of us were called into meetings, the rest covered essential functions. We coordinated lunches and check-ins and legal referrals. When the audit report emerged, its language was careful but consequential. It said what our spreadsheet had said in 1,000 small ways. There were irregular approvals. There were vendors with questionable ties. There were breaks in oversight that allowed funds to move without clear justification. A public hearing followed. People in suits read carefully prepared statements. Journalists leaned forward with their pens and their phones. Someone asked if anyone had been hurt. Another asked whether the practices were systemic or anomalous. I testified. I read from a document whose margins were full of the tiny corrections of 1,000 rehearsed edits. My voice was steady because it had learned steadiness. I described lost receipts, odd routing approvals, and the vendor registered to a mailbox. My testimony did not feel dramatic in the moment. It felt like reading a ledger aloud. The room had the smell of paper and reheated coffee and exhausted concentration. There were consequences. Not all of them immediate. Some were administrative, resignations and restructures. Some were legal, investigations that would stretch for months. But the consequences also touched people in softer ways. People who had been complicit in small ways, approving a dubious invoice because it was easier, had to explain their choices. People who had been ignored by the system found that the same system could be made to pay attention. For me, the consequences were mixed. I had the satisfaction of seeing patterns acknowledged in official documents. I had the strange consolation of knowing that small acts of attention could accumulate into institutional attention. I also had the knowledge that my name would remain in some corners as someone who had been involved. After the hearings, things did not return to the old normal. Normal had been revealed to be a construct that enabled opacity. The new practices were uneven but present, better vendor vetting, clearer approval chains, more transparent ledgers. And yet the human heart carries memory. Some colleagues remained distant. Some doors did not reopen. Some committees rearranged their membership in ways that never referenced the public theater of the audit. I learned acceptance. Acceptance that being cooperative has a cost, and so does being involved. Acceptance that the ledger of a life accrues debits and credits that cannot always be reconciled to a single balance. If these are lessons, then they are small and practical. Lesson: document. A handwritten note with the date can become the hinge of a later account. Lesson: share. An isolated concern becomes more credible when corroborated by others. Lesson: protect. Back up your work. Encrypt what needs encryption. Keep copies in places you control. Lesson: choose your voice. There is utility in measured language and in the accrual of neutral evidence. Lesson: know the costs. There are social costs and professional costs. Weigh them honestly. But the clearest lesson may be moral. Cooperation and involvement are not moral absolutes. They are strategies that each carry trade-offs. Sometimes cooperation is the right daily posture. Sometimes involvement is the necessary escalation. There were things I refused to do. I refused to sign a document without reading it. I refused to approve a payment that did not reconcile. I refused to let an apparent mistake be explained away as a one-off. Refusal is a minor practice. It is not dramatic. It is a small insistence on the records that would later carry weight. Not all victories announce themselves. A policy change appears in an internal memo with bureaucratic language. A vendor is removed from the roster and replaced by a vetted alternative. A new oversight committee meets quarterly instead of annually. These are quiet triumphs. They are incremental and they are durable precisely because they are procedural. They also have human effects. Employees who once felt their concerns would never be heard now file issues with less trepidation. The internal climate shifts toward a fractionally higher transparency. If I speak personally, I will tell you this: the movement from cooperative to involved is not heroic. It is messy. It costs friends and convenience and sometimes peace of mind. But it also makes possible a different future for others. There are moments when I cannot unsay what I have done. There are moments when it is a relief to know a ledger has a line entry that names the odd approval. There is an odd satisfaction in the precision of numbers. Eventually, routine returns. My desk acquired new checklists and a slightly altered set of responsibilities. The world went on. People got better at asking for receipts. The coffee machine still dispensed lukewarm coffee. But the shape of things had shifted. There was less room for misalignment where there had previously been slack. There were more people who knew how to read a ledger for meaning. I would be dishonest if I omitted the hardship. This path brings loneliness and bureaucratic reprisal, and the sense that you are always under a low-level microscope. It also brings the occasional kindness of strangers who say, "We saw what you did." And there is hope. Hope is not a bright banner. It is a small improvement in procedure and an added line in an audit that will not be erased. Hope is also the quiet knowledge that the ledger matters. Numbers, dates, signatures, these are not cold things when they are used to make an account of injustice. They can be the scaffolding for repair. First, I was cooperative. Then I was involved. The words frame a journey that is neither clean nor theatrical. It is a sequence of small decisions, of paper and timestamps, of friendships altered and procedures improved. If you catalog me, you can call me many things. You can call me helpful. You can call me involved. You can file me under risk or civic-minded. What I have learned, in the slow arithmetic of those months, is this: there is a modest heroism in keeping records. There is a modest bravery in asking exact questions and persisting in the face of small erasures. And there is a modest reward in seeing a ledger finally close the gap between what was and what should have been. They did not fire me. They did not arrest me. They did not need to. But I changed the way they cataloged process. First, I was cooperative. Then, I was involved. And sometimes, that is enough. After the hearings, a second catalog appeared. It was unofficial. It lived in glances, pauses, careful phrasing. People began to measure their words around me. Not out of fear, but out of calibration. As if my presence adjusted the room's temperature by a degree or two. I was no longer just cooperative or involved. I was someone who notices. That is a category without a badge. Noticers are inconvenient. They don't raise their voices. They don't interrupt meetings. They write things down. I watched as small habits changed. Receipts were attached without prompting. Approvals were routed twice instead of once. People checked the spelling of names before submitting forms. No one announced these changes. They appeared the way muscles tighten after an injury, unconsciously, protectively. Not everyone understood what had happened. Some thought I had won. Some thought I had lost. Both interpretations were too simple. There is no winning in correction. There is only alignment. There is only the slow reduction of error margins. A junior analyst once asked me quietly, "Was it worth it?" The question carried a hope for arithmetic, a clean balance sheet. I did not answer immediately. Because worth is not a column you can sum. It is a comparison between two futures you will never fully see. I said instead, "It depends on what you can live with." Inside me, the weather shifted slowly. The constant vigilance softened into a practiced awareness. I slept better, not because the world was safer, but because my role was clearer. Fear thrives in ambiguity. Once I understood the terrain, the fear lost some of its teeth. I stopped rehearsing arguments that would never be heard. I focused on what could be documented, what could be shared, what could not be erased without effort. There is a calm that comes from knowing the limits of your influence. You stop trying to convince everyone. You aim instead to leave a trail that someone else can follow. Others began to ask for templates. Not speeches. Not courage. Templates. How do you log concerns without triggering defensiveness? How do you escalate without personalizing the conflict? How do you protect yourself while protecting the record? I shared what I could. Neutral language. Chronological structure. Attachments that speak louder than adjectives. I told them, never accuse when you can describe. Never infer motive when you can show sequence. Never rely on memory when timestamps exist. This is how involvement becomes replicable. It stops being a personality trait and becomes a method. Eventually, I moved teams. Not as punishment. Not as reward. As redistribution. My new role had fewer sharp edges. More review. More synthesis. Less urgency disguised as importance. Some called it sidelining. I called it sustainability. You cannot stay at the center of correction forever. Burnout is another kind of erasure. I trained replacements without naming them as such. I showed them where to look. I taught them how to notice without flaring alarms too early. With distance came perspective. I could see how small my part had been. And how necessary. No system collapses because of one person. No system improves because of one hero. Change is granular. It happens when enough people decide to stop smoothing over discrepancies. When enough people refuse to confuse comfort with correctness. I eventually saw my file. Not officially. In a way that happens when someone forgets to restrict a folder. The labels were there. Cooperative. Involved. Methodical. Persistent. No red dot anymore. Just notes. Dense. Careful. I closed the folder without changing anything. Some records do not need correction. If this sounds like a transformation, it isn't. It is an adjustment, a recalibration of where silence ends and responsibility begins. First, I was cooperative. That taught me how the system breathes. Then I was involved. That taught me where it breaks. Now I am careful. Careful with records. Careful with people. Careful with the quiet power of noticing. And if someone asks me again in a low voice, was it worth it? I will say this. Some systems only change when someone is willing to be reclassified. First cooperative, then involved. Finally, awake. Time does a strange thing to events like these. It sands down the sharp edges. It leaves behind outlines that look cleaner than they ever were. People begin to talk about that period as if it were weather, as if it happened to everyone equally, as if no one made choices inside it. I listen without correcting them. Correction is not always the point. Memory does its work whether you intervene or not. Institutions have long memories but short consciences. They remember outcomes. They forget the tension that preceded them. The emails that once felt dangerous now read like artifacts. The logs that cost sleep now sit archived, compressed, inert. But the habit remains. I still read footnotes. I still notice when numbers arrive too round. I still pause when a process skips a step it once respected. No one told me this would become a skill. Not vigilance, discernment. I can walk into a new system and feel its weak joints. I can tell which approvals exist for safety and which exist for theater. This is not cynicism. Cynicism gives up. This is fluency. I know how narratives are assembled, how delays are justified, how responsibility is diluted until it fits nowhere. And because I know this, I know where to apply pressure without noise, where to ask one question instead of 10. Every so often, the system tests you. Not openly. It slides a small inconsistency across your desk and watches. Do you pass it along? Do you ignore it? Do you correct it quietly and leave no trace? I leave a trace. Not a flare. A notation. Because traces are what separate coincidence from pattern. And patterns are what force systems to tell the truth. There is a question people rarely ask out loud. What happens to those who cooperate all the way? They become invisible. Not punished. Not protected. Absorbed. Their silence oils the machine. Their compliance smooths the numbers. I think of them often. Not with judgment. With understanding. Everyone has a threshold. Mine was crossed by a discrepancy small enough to ignore and large enough to matter. If I were forced to summarize the shift, it would sound unremarkable. I stopped assuming good faith was sufficient. I started insisting that good faith be legible. That is all involvement really is. Making intent readable. Making systems answerable to their own records. I did not burn the bridge. I annotated it, so others could see where it cracked under weight. If you are listening for a moral, it will disappoint you. There is no purity here. Only choices made under fluorescent lights and quiet pressure. First, I was cooperative. That kept me safe. Then I was involved. That kept the record straight. Between safety and truth, I learned the distance. And I learned this last thing. Systems do not fear anger. They do not fear noise. They fear continuity. A person who keeps note